I had camped in bear country before, but I never thought I'd be as close as I was that night. Usually, when you camp in places where bears live, you take all the precautions. Hang your food, cook away from the tent, keep things clean, and make sure you don't leave trash around. I had done all of that. At least I thought I had. It was one of those solo trips where you feel proud of yourself for being self-reliant, carrying your pack into the woods, setting up camp, making fire, cooking, and settling in under the trees. That evening had been calm. I had pitched my tent in a small clearing about 30 yards from a lake, the kind of lake that was still as glass in the evening, reflecting the trees around it. My little fire crackled, and I sat back on my camp chair, full from dinner and feeling that comfortable exhaustion from hiking all day. The woods around me were quiet except for the sounds of frogs croaking and the occasional splash from fish breaking the surface of the water. When I finally crawled into my tent, I was at ease. I had hung my food bag from a tree a good distance away and rinsed out my cooking pot in the lake. Everything smelled clean, nothing that I thought would draw attention. My tent felt safe, my sleeping bag warm, and I drifted off to sleep without a second thought. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up to a sound. At first, it was faint, a steady crunch of leaves and twigs somewhere nearby. My first thought was deer. The forest is full of them, and they wander through campsites all the time without caring much about people. I lay still, listening, waiting for it to fade away. But it didn't fade. It grew closer, heavier. The steps weren't the quick, delicate taps of a deer. They were slower, more deliberate, each one pressing the ground with weight. My stomach tightened. Bears. The thought slipped into my head before I could push it away. I lay frozen, my ears straining. The sound moved closer until it was right outside my tent. I could hear breathing now, low and heavy, like something large drawing in air. My heart raced so hard I could hear it in my ears. I held my breath, hoping maybe it would sniff around and leave. Then the side of my tent sagged inward. A large, round shape pressed against the fabric, making the whole wall lean in. I could see the shadow of it in the faint moonlight. My pulse exploded in my chest. The animal shifted, and the tent shook slightly as it bumped into the poles. I realized with sick certainty that it wasn't just passing by. It was checking me out. I didn't move. I didn't even twitch. I clutched my sleeping bag tight around me, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect me. The bear stayed there for what felt like minutes, leaning its weight against the tent wall, sniffing and huffing. I could smell it now, a musky, wild odor that was so strong it filled the small tent. My whole body was stiff, waiting for claws to rip through or for teeth to clamp down on something. Then, just as suddenly as it leaned in, the weight shifted back. The tent popped upright again, and the sound of heavy paws shuffled in the dirt outside. I slowly turned my head, eyes wide open in the dark, following the sound as it moved around. Through the thin mesh of the window, I caught a glimpse of it when the moonlight hit just right. A big black bear stood a few feet away, its head lowered, shoulders massive, eyes shining faintly. It wasn't aggressive, not the way I always imagined bears would be when they showed up. It just looked confused, like it wasn't sure what it had found. It sat down right there in the clearing, in front of my tent. I could see its round ears shifting as it listened, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. It didn't charge, didn't claw, didn't try to tear its way inside. It just sat there, looking almost like it was thinking. I didn't dare move, but in that strange moment, through my fear, it almost seemed concerned. The way its head tilted, the way it sat so still, it didn't seem like a predator ready to attack. It seemed like it had stumbled onto something it didn't understand and wasn't sure what to do about it. Still, my body screamed with fear. I knew how quickly a bear could change its mind. I knew that one wrong move could trigger it. I lay still for what felt like forever, watching it, barely breathing. My muscles ached from holding so still, but I didn't move an inch. After a while, the bear shifted its weight and stood. It turned its head toward me one last time. My chest tightened, expecting the worst, but instead, it slowly lumbered away. No hurry, no panic, just a calm, heavy walk back into the trees. The sound of its steps faded, swallowed by the forest. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed awake until dawn, every sound keeping me on edge. Every snap of a twig, sent adrenaline through me, even though the bear was long gone. When the first light filled the clearing, I finally crawled out of the tent. The ground told the story of what had happened. Prints circled my tent, big round pads pressed into the dirt. The stones around my fire pit had been nudged out of place. My chair was tipped over. Nothing was destroyed, but the signs were there. An animal had been curious, testing, deciding what to do. I walked to where I had hung my food bag. It was untouched, still swinging from the branch. Not at exactly how I left it. The bear hadn't gone for it. It had come to me instead. That thought sent a chill through me. It wasn't after my food. It was curious about me. I packed up camp that morning faster than I ever had before. My hands shook as I rolled my sleeping bag, stuffed the tent into its sack, and shouldered my pack. The woods felt different now, no longer peaceful or welcoming. Every tree seemed to hide a shadow. Every sound could have been something big moving nearby. The hike out was tense. My head turned constantly, checking behind me, scanning the trail ahead, ears tuned to every sound. My knife stayed in my hand most of the way, though I knew it would be useless against something that big. My legs moved fast, my body running on adrenaline even when the pack dug into my shoulders and sweat ran down my back. When I finally stepped out of the trees and saw my car waiting where I had left it, the relief was almost overwhelming. I tossed my pack in the back, slid into the driver's seat, and sat for a long moment before starting the engine. My heart was still pounding, but I was safe. Driving away, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The way the bear sat in the moonlight, confused, almost gentle, like it hadn't meant to scare me. Maybe it hadn't, but that didn't matter. The truth was, it could have ended differently in a second. One wrong move, one flicker of aggression, and I wouldn't have made it out. That night, I learned what it really feels like to be small, to be powerless in the face of something wild and strong. The bear wasn't angry, it wasn't vicious. It was just there, curious, alive in its own world. But that was enough to leave me shaken. I still camp, but that night changed me. I double-check everything now. I never let myself forget that I'm just a visitor in the woods, and that at any moment, something bigger, stronger, and far more at home out there can appear. And when I close my eyes at night, sometimes I still see the shape of that bear sitting quietly outside my tent, watching, deciding, before slipping back into the dark. I always thought I understood what it meant to be alone in the woods. I had camped before, I had hiked, and I had done my share of overnights in places far from towns or traffic. But there is a difference between choosing to be alone and realizing you might not be as alone as you thought. That difference is sharp, heavy, and it changes how every sound, every shadow, every snap of a branch feels. It cuts into your nerves until you can't relax, until every breath feels too loud. This trip was supposed to be simple. A long weekend away from the city, a chance to clear my head and sleep under open skies. I picked a forested area a few hours' drive from home, a stretch of land with lakes, rivers, and endless trails. Not a popular campground, not the type with fire pits and numbered plots, just wilderness. The kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. That was exactly what I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was still up but already sinking, spilling through the trees in slanted lines. The air had that heavy green smell of pine and wet dirt. I parked off a rough road, shouldered my pack, and walked in until the car and road noises disappeared. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, the more it felt like I had stepped out of one world and into another. I picked a spot beside a narrow clearing, a place with a flat patch of ground where I could set up the tent, not too far from a stream, close enough that I could hear the trickle of water if I stood still. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, because part of the ritual of camping for me was settling in, turning a patch of forest into temporary home. Tent staked, sleeping bag rolled out, small fire pit built from stones I gathered. I cooked a simple meal and sat by the fire as the sky darkened and the stars came out. The quiet was deep but not silent. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked, the stream gurgled, and somewhere deeper in the trees, something small moved through underbrush. The first night passed without trouble. I slept off and on, waking at times to the sound of branches shifting in the wind or a distant owl. Every time, I told myself it was nothing unusual. Woods are alive, they move and breathe in their own way. The next morning, I hiked. I left camp light, just my water, some snacks, a compass, and a knife. The trail I followed wasn't marked, just a game trail, worn enough to walk without too much trouble. I walked for hours, losing myself in the rhythm of my steps and the constant shift of light through trees. I crossed a patch of swampy ground, hopped over fallen logs, and skirted a ridge where the trees opened to show a slice of the sky. By midday, I turned back. I wanted to get back before dark. As I came closer to camp, I felt that relief of recognizing familiar markers, the shape of a broken tree, the bend of the stream. But as I stepped back into the clearing, I froze. Something was wrong. At first it was subtle, something that nagged rather than screamed. My tent flap was open. I was certain I had zipped it shut before I left. My pack, which I had left inside, was sitting outside on the ground. I stared at it for a long time, my heart beginning to race. Animals? I told myself. Raccoons? Maybe. A bear? Though nothing looked torn or clawed. I crouched and checked. My food bag had been dragged out, but not ripped apart. It looked almost placed, sitting neatly beside the tent. My gear was scattered but not damaged. My sleeping bag was halfway unrolled. It looked less like an animal rummaged through and more like someone had been looking. The hair on my neck stood up. I scanned the tree line, slow, careful, trying not to let my eyes dart too fast. Nothing moved. The forest looked exactly the same, but it didn't feel the same anymore. I stayed put, crouched, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack everything up and leave right then. Another part told me it could be nothing. Maybe even I left the flap open without realizing. I forced myself to check everything. My knife was still there. My flashlight. My spare clothes. The only thing that seemed missing was one of the granola bars I had packed. Just one. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the unease. I tried to relax, to read a little, to fish at the stream, but every sound drew my attention. Every time the wind shifted the trees, I looked up fast, expecting to see someone. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the glow to announce where I was. I ate cold food, sat in the dark, and listened. I thought maybe whoever had come, if anyone really had, might come back at night. Hours passed. The forest grew darker, colder. My eyes adjusted, and I could see the faint outline of trees against the sky. I kept scanning, waiting. Then I heard it. Not the normal shuffle of a small animal, not the crack of a branch falling. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crushing leaves. Somewhere behind the tent, just far enough that I couldn't see. I held my breath and listened, my whole body tense. The steps paused, then shifted, circling. I grabbed the knife from my side and crouched low inside the tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe loud. My heart slammed against my ribs. Whoever it was, they were close. I could hear them step, stop, step again. Not rushing, not careless, careful. They circled once, then faded into the woods. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. I didn't dare leave the tent. I didn't sleep. By morning, when the light began to seep through the trees, I crawled out slowly. The clearing looked normal. No footprints that I could see, the ground too hard for that. But something was different. My fire pit stones had been rearranged, just slightly, just enough that I knew. That day, I made a plan. I decided I would leave the next morning. I had enough food to last, and it would be safer to travel in daylight. Until then, I'd stay sharp, keep watch, and not wander far. The day crawled by. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking the tree line, circling camp, watching for movement. The silence pressed heavier than before. Every hour felt stretched thin. When night came, I sat awake again. I didn't zip the tent this time. I wanted to be able to move fast if I had to. I kept the knife in my hand, the flashlight at my side. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. I turned the flashlight on and aimed it out the flap. The beam cut across the trees and caught something. A figure, a man, standing just at the edge of the clearing. He turned his face away from the light, but I saw enough. A beard, tangled hair, clothes dirty and torn. He didn't run. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I kept the light on him, my hand shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. After a moment, he stepped back into the trees and was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat until dawn, every muscle tight, waiting for him to return. When the sky brightened, I tore the camp down fast. I stuffed everything into my pack without caring how neat it was. I doused the fire pit, shouldered the pack, and left. I didn't take the trail. I cut straight through the woods, aiming for the direction of the car. I moved fast, too fast, stumbling over roots, crashing through brush. My head spun, checking behind me, scanning every shadow. At one point, I thought I heard him following. A branch snapping, too heavy for an animal. I broke into a run. My chest burned, my legs shook, but I kept going. Hours later, when I finally burst out onto the road, I almost collapsed. My car was there, untouched. I threw my pack inside, started the engine, and drove without looking back. Only when I was miles away, pavement under my tires, did I let myself breathe fully. I never reported it. What would I say? A man in the woods, watching me, rearranging things in my camp? No real crime, nothing to prove it. But I know what I felt. I know how close he came to me, how long he must have been there, waiting, circling. I still camp, sometimes, but never alone, never that deep, and never without thinking about the way those footsteps sounded in the dark, slow and patient, like they had all the time in the world. I remember the trip clearly, even though I've tried to push it out of my head 100 times since it happened. I went into those woods looking for peace, but what I found was something that changed how I look at the idea of being alone in the wilderness. I always thought the isolation was the part one loved most, but after that night, I realized isolation was also the most dangerous thing I could put myself through. It started as a normal weekend trip. I had planned it for weeks, studying maps and tracing my route carefully. I didn't want an easy campsite off a popular trail where families would be cooking hot dogs 100 yards away. I wanted real solitude, so I picked a region I knew was remote, an area of forest that stretched miles with no marked campsites. It was an old logging area that hadn't been touched in years, where the land had grown back wild and thick. I drove up early Friday morning, bumping my truck along a dirt road that seemed more like a dry creek bed than anything meant for vehicles. The deeper I went, the rougher the road became until finally I parked in a small pull-off, shut off the engine, and loaded my pack. There was no sign of anyone else. No cars, no trash, not even old tire ruts. Just quiet woods pressing in on all sides. The hike in was long. My pack was heavy with gear, tent, bag, food, water filter, small hatchet, and the other little things you need to survive a couple nights alone. The air smelled damp and clean, the kind of smell that makes you realize how stale city air is. I crossed a few narrow streams, climbed over fallen logs, and followed faint deer trails deeper into the trees. It took me most of the day to get where I wanted, far enough that I knew nobody would stumble across me. I picked a spot for camp just before dusk. It was a small clearing beside a slope, with tall pines standing around it like sentinels. A trickle of water ran at the bottom of the slope, perfect for filling my bottle. The ground was mostly flat, covered in a carpet of needles, soft enough for sleeping. It looked like it had been waiting for me to set up there. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and got to work. Tent first, then firewood. I gathered dry branches from the forest floor, snapped them over my knee, and stacked them neatly. By the time the tent was pitched and my fire started, the sun had fallen low, streaking orange light through the trees. I boiled some water, cooked a pouch of rice, and ate it slowly as the fire warmed my face. The woods were quiet as night took over. The sound of the water at the bottom of the slope blended with the occasional call of an owl. Beyond the circle of firelight, the forest turned black. I always thought that part of the night, when the fire is alive and the world outside is swallowed in dark, was both the most comforting and the most unnerving. Comforting because the fire feels like safety, unnerving because you know how little it really protects you from. After cleaning up, I sat near the flames until my eyes grew heavy. I finally put out the fire, crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and slid into my bag. The nylon walls felt thin, but they cut the wind and held the warmth. I lay there listening to the soft sounds of the forest until sleep pulled me under. At some point deep in the night, I woke up. At first I thought it was nothing, just the usual stirring that happens when you're not in your own bed. But then I realized what had woken me. A sound. It was faint, but clear. Crunch, crunch. The slow sound of footsteps. Not the scurry of a rabbit or the soft pad of a raccoon. This was heavier, measured, human. I froze, eyes wide open in the dark. My ears strained to pick it up again. The steps were on the slope, near the stream. They weren't rushing or stumbling, just steady, like someone walking slowly, trying not to make noise but failing against the brittle ground. The first thought that hit me was that maybe another hiker had wandered nearby, but I knew that was nearly impossible. I had bushwhacked miles into this forest, far from any marked trail. The chances of someone else camping this close were slim, and if it was another camper, why move so slowly at that hour, creeping near my tent? The steps drew closer. I could picture them climbing up the slope, one careful step at a time. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, louder than the noises outside. I lay perfectly still, afraid even to shift in my sleeping bag. I reached for the hatchet I had left beside the tent wall, but my fingers brushed only fabric. I had left it just outside the door after cutting wood. The realization made my chest tighten. The footsteps reached the clearing. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Whoever it was stood there, only feet away, not moving, not speaking, just standing. I could feel it, the presence of someone outside, watching. I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed. My chest burned from the effort of keeping still. Finally, after what felt like forever, the steps started again. This time they circled. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the tent. I could hear the crunch of needles shifting as they traced the perimeter, pausing at times, then moving again. My mind raced. If it was an animal, it would snort, shuffle, make noise other than steps. This was different. This was calculated, human. The circle completed, and then the steps moved off, back down the slope, fading slowly into the night until finally there was nothing but the faint trickle of water again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there stiff, eyes open, ears tuned to every sound. My thoughts spiraled who it could be, what they wanted, why they didn't announce themselves. The hours dragged until finally, mercifully, the sky lightened and dawn crept through the trees. When I stepped outside, the clearing looked the same as before. Tent intact, gear untouched, but the ground told the story. Boot prints, clear impressions in the soil, circling the tent just as I had heard. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there. The tread was different from my boots too, larger, deeper. I crouched down, staring at them with a tight knot in my stomach. Whoever it was hadn't stumbled upon me by accident. They had walked around my tent, silent, in the middle of the night, and then slipped back into the woods without a word. I packed up fast. My hands shook as I rolled the bag and shoved it into my pack. I kept looking up at the trees, half expecting someone to step out and watch me. The woods that had felt peaceful the day before now felt like they were hiding something, pressing in close. The hike out was brutal. Every sound behind me made me spin. Every shadow looked like movement. I pushed hard, barely stopping for water, my shoulders aching from the weight of the pack. I wanted distance. I wanted out. When I finally saw my truck, sitting alone on the dirt pull-off, I nearly broke into a run. I threw my gear in the bed, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before starting the engine. I didn't look back as I drove, the trees sliding by in a blur. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, pavement finally under my tires, that I let myself breathe properly. I've camped since then, but never the same way. I don't go that deep alone anymore. I keep my camps closer to trails, places where people pass through, where I know I'm not completely cut off, because that night taught me something I can't unlearn. The woods don't scare me. The dark doesn't scare me, but people do. Someone had stood outside my tent, circling, silent, watching. They could have done anything, but they chose not to, and I'll never know why. That not knowing is worse than anything else. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I sometimes hear it. Crunch, crunch, the slow, careful steps of boots circling my tent. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. The idea of being away from everything, no phone service, no constant traffic noise, no people, was something I craved more than I cared to admit. Life had felt heavy, and when it does, I always find myself heading out to the woods. The deeper, the better. This time, I picked a stretch of forest I had never camped in before. It was far north, hours from the nearest small town, and from what I had read, very few people bothered going in that deep unless they were hunters or serious backpackers. That was exactly the kind of place I wanted. I left my truck on the side of a rough dirt road just after noon. The kind of road so rutted and narrow it barely looked used at all. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders and started hiking in. The first miles were along an old logging path, but soon that thinned into little more than a trail, and then finally nothing at all. I followed the compass, cut across small creeks, and pushed through thick brush until the sounds of anything human were long behind me. By late afternoon, I came across a clearing that looked promising. A wide circle of ground opened between tall pines, soft needles carpeting the earth. A stream trickled about 50 yards off to the side, enough to give me water but far enough that the noise wouldn't drown out the forest sounds. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and breathed deep. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of pine and damp soil. I set up my tent first, a small two-man dome tent that I always used when solo camping. It was easy enough to pitch, and within minutes I had it staked down, my sleeping bag spread inside, and my pack leaning next to it. After that, I gathered wood for a fire, careful to collect only fallen limbs and not strip anything green. By the time I got a decent pile together, the sun had dropped low, filtering gold through the trees. I got the fire going, fed it until the flames were steady, and set up a small cooking spot with my metal cup and pan. Dinner was simple, dried rice and a pouch of beans I had brought along, cooked over the fire until it was warm enough to eat. I sat cross-legged near the flames, eating slowly, watching the forest shadows stretch. The longer I sat, the quieter the woods seemed to grow. Birds called less and less, and soon all I heard was the crackle of my fire and the faint gurgle of the stream. Darkness came quick after that. The firelight made the trees flicker and dance, but beyond it, the woods were black. There was no moon that night, just stars that poked faintly through the canopy when I looked up. I sat for a long while, tossing in sticks, staring into the flames, listening to the occasional snap of a twig somewhere out in the dark. When I finally crawled into my tent, it felt warm compared to the chill air outside. I zipped the flap shut, slid into my bag, and laid there listening. The forest at night is never silent. I heard the distant call of an owl, the faint rustle of something moving in the brush, maybe a rabbit or raccoon. I told myself it was nothing unusual, just the regular night shift of the woods, and slowly I drifted off. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had long since burned down to cold ashes, and the only light was the faintest gray starlight pressing through the thin fabric of the tent. I lay there, blinking, until I realized what had stirred me. There was a sound outside. It wasn't the usual small scurry of an animal. This was heavier, slow, deliberate steps pressing into the earth. The kind of sound you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. Something was moving around my camp. I froze, my heart thudding hard. The steps were careful, like whatever it was didn't want to make noise. That made it worse. I strained to listen, every nerve awake. I could make out the crunch of pine needles, the shift of weight on soil, moving just past the tent. For a long time, it circled. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady, patient movement in the dark. I pictured a bear, nose to the ground, smelling my food. I pictured a person, standing out there, looking at the glow of my tent. Both thoughts made my mouth go dry. At one point, the steps stopped completely. Silence pressed in so heavy that my ears rang. I didn't dare move. My sleeping bag felt like a trap, holding me down when all I wanted was to sit up and grab the hatchet I had left near the door. Seconds stretched long, each one feeling like a full minute. Then the sound came again, softer now, moving away into the trees until finally it faded. I laid there the rest of the night, wide awake, flinching at every small sound. I thought about unzipping the flap to look, but the thought of seeing something standing there in the dark kept me still. The hours crawled, and eventually the faint gray of dawn began to creep through the tent. When I finally got up, the camp looked untouched. Nothing was dragged off. No prints I could see right away. But then I noticed the ground near the fire pit. In the dirt, faint but visible, were impressions. Not the paw prints of a bear or coyote. These were boots. Human. The tracks circled the tent once, then wandered off toward the trees. I crouched there staring at them for a long time, my stomach tight. I had come miles into the forest, far off trail, where I thought no one would bother going. Yet someone had been there, close enough to touch the walls of my tent if they wanted. I thought back to the way the steps paused, how long they stood silent. They had been watching. I packed up quickly that morning, every few minutes glancing into the trees. My hands shook as I shoved gear into my bag. The woods, once calming, now felt like they were closing in. Every shadow between the trees looked like it could be hiding someone. The hike back felt longer than it had coming in. My ears played tricks on me the entire way, every snapped branch sounding too close, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision making me spin. I never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. When I reached the road and saw my truck, relief washed over me. I threw my pack in, started the engine, and drove without looking back. But even now, the memory stays sharp. Not the woods, not the stars, not the fire, just the sound of those careful footsteps circling my tent and the clear marks of boots pressed into the soil the next morning. I had always thought the scariest part of camping alone was the wildlife, the possibility of a bear nosing into camp or a coyote creeping close. But that trip taught me different. Animals act on instinct. It's people you can't predict. Out there, miles from help, I realized how small and vulnerable I really was. And I'll never forget the feeling of lying in that tent, knowing someone was standing just feet away, silent, in the dark. I had been hiking all day through thick woods before I finally settled on a flat patch of ground near a stand of birch trees. The place seemed quiet and safe enough, far enough from the trail that no one would stumble across me, but still close to a small stream where I could refill my bottle. I dropped my pack, stretched out my shoulders, and started setting up camp. The sun was sliding down low, the light turning golden and filtering through the leaves in long rays. That part of the evening is always my favorite, when the world feels calm but you know darkness is creeping in soon. I pitched my tent, collected some branches and twigs, and got a small fire going before the night set in. The fire popped and cracked while I cooked a simple meal, the smell rising into the cooling air. I ate slowly, letting the fatigue of the day settle into my bones. I always liked being alone out there, but there's something about sitting by a fire in the middle of nowhere that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. The forest wasn't silent, not completely. I heard the occasional bird call, the shuffle of something small in the brush, the wind moving the branches overhead. By the time I was finished eating, the sky had gone dark, the kind of thick darkness where the trees just turn into tall shadows against even deeper black. I banked the fire down and crawled into my tent. The nylon walls gave a sense of safety, even though I knew they would do nothing against anything truly determined. Still, it was warmer inside, and the faint smell of earth and fabric made it easier to close my eyes. At first, sleep came easily. My body was worn out, and I sank into my bag like a stone. But I woke later to a strange noise. It wasn't loud, not like branches breaking or an animal snorting, but faint and steady, a kind of scratching. I lay still, listening. It came from directly under me, under the ground. A scraping, shuffling movement, then a pause, then more scratching. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it. At first I thought it might be roots shifting or the soil settling, but the rhythm was too irregular for that. Something alive was moving under the earth. My mind jumped to moles, burrowing through their tunnels, their claws dragging against the soil. I remembered reading somewhere that moles were nearly blind, living their whole lives in the dark. I wondered what it would be like, wandering through endless tunnels with no real sense of the world above. The thought made my skin crawl. The scratching grew louder, closer to the surface. It was right beneath where I lay, like something tunneling directly under my sleeping bag. I shifted slightly, trying not to make much noise, and pressed my ear against the thin floor of the tent. The vibrations carried up through the ground, soft but real. Whatever it was moving back and forth, circling under me like it was confused or searching. The idea that a blind creature was feeling its way just below me unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I imagined its small face, its pink snout poking through loose dirt, its claws digging blindly. Did it know I was above? Did it sense the heat of my body, the weight pressing down on the earth? Was it curious, or just lost in its endless dark maze? I sat up slowly, clutching my flashlight, though I didn't turn it on. Shining it wouldn't help. Whatever was beneath me couldn't be seen from inside the tent. I listened instead, heart pounding. The sound came again, scrape, scrape, then a pause, then a muffled thump as if it had struck a rock. Then silence. For a while I thought it had gone. My muscles started to relax, but then, out of nowhere, the earth shifted under the corner of the tent. It was subtle, but I felt the ground rise just slightly, then settle back. I froze, staring at that spot. The scratching picked up again, slow but steady, tracing a line along the tent floor, circling me like a slow-moving ripple. I couldn't stand it anymore. I unzipped the door and crawled outside, the cool night air rushing over me. The fire had gone down to faint embers, glowing weakly in the pit. I crouched low, scanning the ground around the tent with my light. At first, nothing, just grass, leaves, and soil. Then I noticed a small raised line cutting through the dirt, fresh, as if the earth had been pushed up from below. The tunnel. I followed the line a few feet, my beam of light tracing it. The soil quivered, just faintly, as something moved beneath it. My chest tightened. I realized then how thin the barrier was between me and it. The ground was fragile, only a few inches of soil between the surface and the thing making those tunnels. I crouched there, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached, and watched the line move forward. It wavered left and right, almost aimless, like the creature underneath had no idea where it was going. I couldn't stop myself from imagining what it thought it was running into when it passed beneath my tent. Did it sense the weight, the heat, the strangeness of a living body pressed above the dirt? Was it afraid? Or did it just keep pushing blindly forward, not knowing what I was? The ground stilled again. The line stopped, and I couldn't see any more movement. I waited, crouched low, shivering in the cold air. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint breeze through the trees. I finally stepped back, scanning the woods with the beam, my ears tuned for the smallest sound. I didn't want to sit around waiting for it to come back, but I also knew I couldn't just hike off into the night. I was stuck with it, whether I liked it or not. I eventually forced myself back into the tent, though I lay on the opposite side from where I'd heard the noises before. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the scratching starting again, the ground bulging up, something breaking the surface. My ears stayed open to every shift of dirt, every tiny vibration. Hours dragged, and I felt more awake than asleep the whole night. When the first gray light of dawn slipped through the trees, I climbed out of the tent, relieved beyond words to see the world lit again. The raised line in the dirt was still there, stretching in uneven patterns around my camp. Freshly turned soil marked where it had moved during the night, looping around my tent like it had been tracing me in circles. I stared at those lines for a long time, trying to piece together what they meant. It wasn't random. It had lingered near me longer than chance alone would explain. I packed up quickly, shoving my gear into my pack with clumsy hands. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted distance between me and that place. As I hiked out, I kept thinking about it. A small blind creature, digging endlessly in the dark. I wondered what it had felt when it reached the earth beneath me. Did it stop in confusion? Did it sense me somehow? Wonder if I was just another obstacle in its path, or something else entirely? The idea of being the object of curiosity for something that lived its entire life underground unsettled me far more than any bear or coyote ever had. Those animals, at least, I understood. But this was a mind I couldn't imagine, moving through tunnels without sight, brushing close to me without ever truly knowing me. By the time I reached the trailhead, the fear had dulled into something heavier, something that stuck with me even after I drove home. I kept picturing those fresh tunnels in the dirt, circling my tent all night long. I'll never know what it thought, or if it even thought at all. But the truth that shook me was simple. I had been nothing more than a shadow above its world, a strange shape it bumped into in the dark. And yet, for those hours, I had been completely at its mercy, waiting, wondering, hoping it wouldn't decide to come through the thin skin of earth that separated us. I remember that trip so clearly because it was the one camp where the story I heard stayed with me long after I went back home. I had camped many times before, and I was used to the typical ghost stories and exaggerated tales people told around the fire, but that one night was different. It didn't sound like a ghost story. It sounded like something that had actually happened, and it felt too raw and too real to laugh off. The camp was deep in the woods, far enough from town that when the sun went down the darkness felt absolute. The counselors had built a fire in the middle of a clearing, and the rest of us sat in a circle, our faces lit orange by the flames while the woods beyond looked black and endless. I was young enough then to still feel nervous when the counselors tried to spook us with stories, but old enough to know they were usually just doing it for fun. I thought this would be no different until one of the older men, who had been helping at camp for years, decided to share a story I had never heard before. He started talking slowly, in a calm voice, as if he was just remembering something from long ago. He said there was once a man found in the woods, not far from where we were camping. He was a large man, bigger than most, and the police said he had been killed quickly, almost cleanly. There was nothing strange about the scene except for one thing. On his left hand, he was missing half of his pointer finger, his ring finger, and his pinky finger. No one could ever find the missing pieces, and there were no tracks, no weapon, and no real clues to point to who had done it. At first, I thought it was just another one of those grisly but vague stories, something meant to unsettle us but not really taken from real life. But he kept going, and it grew more disturbing with every detail. A few weeks after the first body was discovered, another one turned up. This time it was a man smaller than the first, not as heavy and not as tall. The situation was the same. Quick death, no noise, no struggle, and again those same 3 fingers missing from the left hand. And again, nothing was ever found. No traces of the killer, no weapon, not even the fingers themselves. Just gone. He said the police started paying closer attention then, realizing there might be a pattern, but they had nothing to work with. Then, after more weeks had passed, another body appeared in the woods. This time it was a woman, smaller still than the second man. Same cause of death, same 3 fingers missing. He described it in such a plain way that it felt different than the usual campfire exaggeration. There was no mention of shadows, no suggestion of spirits, no strange lights. Just people being killed, each one smaller than the last, and each one losing the same 3 fingers. The pattern went on. Each new body was smaller than the last. He said it seemed like the killer was moving through people, one after another, with no real connection between them other than size. Eventually, children were found. Some were teenagers, some even younger, their bodies hidden but discovered after people started noticing the disappearances. Always the same details, always the same fingers missing from the left hand. What disturbed me most was when he described one of the last victims before the police finally found something. It was a teenage boy, older than most of the younger kids who had been killed, but smaller than the adult victims. His left hand only had 2 fingers missing that time, the ring finger and the pinky finger. The pointer finger was still there. That was the first break in the pattern. At that scene, for the first time, investigators found a fingerprint. It was pressed into something at the site, and when they ran it, it came back to the record of a theft committed years earlier. The print belonged to the previous victim, the one who had been found before the teenager. That detail stuck with me because it meant the killer had somehow left behind the fingerprint of someone already dead. The story didn't go into how exactly that happened, but the way it was told, it made sense in a horrible way. The man by the fire said the police eventually put it together. They realized the killer wasn't just taking fingers as trophies. He was looking for replacements. The missing fingers, the way the victims grew smaller and smaller, it all pointed to him searching for a match. He wanted new fingers, and he was testing to see if they would fit. The thought of someone doing that, killing and cutting just to see if a body part would match his own hand, made my skin crawl even as I sat there listening, staring into the fire because I didn't want to look at him. He kept telling it calmly until he reached the part about how no one knew if the killer had ever succeeded. No one knew if he had found the fingers that matched. He said the police reports had stopped, but that didn't mean the man had stopped. He could still be out there, maybe even closer than we thought, maybe even waiting for the right person with the right hand. Then, as the fire popped and the woods seemed to close in tighter around us, he said that's why people should always pay attention to stories like these. Because sometimes they weren't just stories. Sometimes they were warnings. And then he did something I never forgot. He pulled off one of his gloves. His left hand was scarred. His pointer finger was there, but it was twisted, the skin warped like it had been badly injured long ago. His ring finger and his pinky finger were gone, cut off halfway down, just stubs left behind. The firelight flickered across the damaged skin, and for a second I felt my stomach turn. He lunged toward the group then, screaming suddenly, and a few kids shrieked and scrambled back from the fire. For a moment, the whole group was frozen in shock. My heart hammered so hard I thought I was going to pass out. And then he stopped, laughing to himself, holding up his hand again. He explained that he had lost the two fingers in a work accident years earlier, and the doctors had only managed to save the mangled pointer finger. He admitted that he told the story every year, that it was just a way to scare campers, that the bodies and the missing fingers were nothing more than a tale. Some of the younger kids laughed nervously after realizing they weren't really in danger, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a story. The way he described the bodies, the way the details lined up, the way his own hand looked in the firelight, it didn't feel like something made up for fun. It felt too close to reality. That night, I barely slept. Every crack of a branch outside the tent made me jolt awake. I kept looking at my own left hand in the darkness, curling my fingers into my palm as if that would protect them. I didn't hear footsteps, and no one came near us, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept thinking about how each victim had been smaller than the last, and how the pattern had eventually reached kids about my size. When camp ended, I went home, but the story came with me. I found myself checking the locks on the doors more often, keeping my bedroom window shut even on hot nights, and pulling my blankets up to my neck even though it made me sweat. I never knew for sure if the man at camp had made it all up. Maybe he had. Maybe it was nothing but a well-rehearsed story he liked to use to see kids jump. But even if it was, it worked too well. The image of his hand, scarred and missing those same two fingers, stayed in my head. The fact that he said it had been an accident didn't erase the unease. I always wondered if the accident came first, or if the story had grown from something real, something darker that he only told in pieces. Years later, I still think about it when I'm out in the woods. I can sit by a fire, I can enjoy the silence of the trees, but a part of me always feels like I'm being watched, like there's someone out there checking to see if my hand might be the right size. It's not a ghost that scares me, not something supernatural or unexplainable. It's the idea of someone real, someone with a need so strange and violent that they would kill again and again just to make their body whole. That's the kind of story that doesn't go away. That's the kind of story that makes camping feel different, even when everything is quiet, even when the night seems safe. Because once you've heard it, you can't help but picture the firelight on that damaged hand, and you can't help but wonder if all he lost really was just from an accident. I'll never forget the night that storm rolled in, because it was one of the few times in my life where I thought I might not make it through. I had camped through plenty of rough weather before. Steady rains, high winds, even hail once or twice. But nothing compared to the chaos of that thunderstorm and the tornado that came with it. I went into that night expecting just another round of rain and wind. What I got was a test of patience and nerves I wouldn't wish on anyone. The day had been calm enough, though the air felt heavy in a way that put me on edge. The kind of weight in the air where the sky looks bruised before the first clouds even gather, and the silence in the woods feels unnatural. The breeze had died down by late afternoon, and everything was still. No birds, no rustling of branches, just heat and humidity pressing against me as I set up camp. I pitched my tent on a small rise not far from a tree line, thinking it would give me a little drainage if rain came. At the time, I didn't realize how lucky that choice would turn out to be. By dusk, the sky had started changing. The light dimmed faster than it should have, and the horizon turned a sick shade of green mixed with gray. I had seen enough storms to know that wasn't a good sign. I ate quickly, listening to the first distant rolls of thunder echo through the woods. The sound didn't fade. It grew, and with it the wind began to stir again, slow at first and then sharper, pushing through the trees with sudden bursts that made the branches creak. I crawled into my tent, zipped it tight, and waited. The first wave of rain hit not long after, heavy drops that hammered the fabric so hard I thought it might tear. The wind snapped at the sides, pulling the stakes tight in the ground, and flashes of lightning lit up the whole clearing in stark white bursts. At first, the strikes were spaced out, 10 seconds between the flash and the rumble, but before long they were nearly on top of each other. Then the storm settled right over me. The lightning became constant. It wasn't just flashes anymore. It was strobe lights, one after another, so quick that the woods looked like they were caught under a camera shutter firing nonstop. I could see every tree around my clearing, every branch bending, every movement of the grass. Then it would go black for half a second, only to explode again in white light. My tent felt like it was glowing. I pressed my hands against the floor and the walls, waiting for the next strike to rip one of the poles out of the ground. The thunder stopped being separate crashes. It rolled into one long, endless growl that shook the ground and rattled in my chest. It was the kind of sound you don't just hear, you feel it through your bones. And then came the roar. At first, I thought it was just wind whipping harder through the trees, but the pitch of it was wrong. It grew deeper, louder, like the growl of some massive machine bearing down on me. The noise swelled until it was all I could hear, drowning out even the constant thunder. That was when I knew it wasn't just wind, it was a tornado. The sound is hard to explain if you've never heard it. People compare it to a freight train, but when you're sitting alone in a thin nylon tent with nothing around you but trees and wet earth, it feels more like the entire sky tearing apart. It moved past me, not directly overhead but close enough that the suction of it pulled at the air around me. The tent walls bowed inward like hands pressing against them, and for a terrifying few seconds I thought the whole thing would rip away and leave me exposed to whatever came next. Branches cracked and snapped in the distance, thudding against the ground in sharp, violent breaks. The roar shifted from one side to the other, a path tearing across the land only a couple of kilometers away. I sat there, gripping the ground like that could anchor me, listening to nature rip itself apart just out of reach. The rain poured so hard it felt like the stream next to my camp might burst free and flood everything. There was no choice but to ride it out. I couldn't run, not into that storm, not across wet ground with lightning striking in every direction. I couldn't do anything but sit in the tent, heart pounding, counting the seconds between my breaths while the tornado cut its path nearby. Every second stretched into a minute. Every noise felt like the last thing I might hear. Then, just as suddenly as it had grown, the roar began to fade. The thunder rolled on, the lightning still burst across the sky, but the low, violent growl of the tornado pulled further and further away until it was just another sound in the distance. I realized I had been holding my breath without meaning to. My hands were stiff from clutching the tent floor. I forced myself to move, to check the seams, to make sure the stakes were still tight. Somehow, my little tent had held. The storm lasted for hours longer. The lightning stayed near constant, sometimes so bright it felt like I was trapped in daylight, then plunging back into blackness only to flare again. The rain hammered on until the ground outside turned to mud. But without the tornado's roar, it all felt survivable again. Dangerous, yes, but familiar. Rain, wind, thunder, I had seen those before. By the time the first gray light of morning crept into the sky, the storm had passed. The woods were drenched, branches scattered across the ground, leaves plastered to the mud. Steam rose from the earth as the sun started to warm it, and the whole forest smelled like wet dirt and broken wood. I stepped out of my tent, stiff and sore, and took it all in. My camp had survived, but the world around me looked like it had been shaken apart. Later, when I hiked back toward the trailhead, I saw where the tornado had cut through. It wasn't just fallen branches or a few broken trees. It was a swath of destruction, a path carved clean through the forest where nothing had been spared. Trees were snapped at their bases, some twisted and uprooted, lying in tangled piles. The ground itself looked torn, as if something had clawed across it with enormous force. And the path was wide, stretching far in both directions, showing just how much power had swept past me in the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the aftermath. It struck me how close I had been. A couple of kilometers was nothing out there. If that funnel had shifted even a little, I might not have been standing there at all. My tent, my gear, my body, it all would have been shredded or carried off without a trace. That night taught me something that has stayed with me ever since. Out in the woods, you can prepare for animals, you can prepare for hunger, you can prepare for getting lost. But when the sky decides to tear itself open, there's nothing you can do but hang on and hope you're not in its path. I didn't fight that storm. I didn't beat it. I just sat there, waiting while it passed me by. And the only reason I'm able to tell the story now is because of luck, pure, blind luck that the tornado cut its path just far enough away. Every time I camp now, I remember that night. I still love the woods. I still chase the peace of being alone out there, but I always watch the sky differently. The quiet before a storm doesn't feel the same anymore. The heavy air, the stillness, the wrong colors in the clouds, they remind me how quickly things can turn. Because no matter how strong you are, no matter how much gear you bring, when the sky starts roaring like that, you're small. You're nothing but a person in a thin tent, riding it out and hoping the storm shows you mercy.